The lights were soft gold, the kind that turns crystal into small suns, and my name was printed on a lacquered place card beside 5 unclaimed settings. The ballroom hummed with the clink of glass and the low tide of conversation. But at my table, the sound was different, too much linen, too few voices. 6 chairs, arranged like a promise, no one kept. When the MC's microphone cracked to life, I smoothed the satin at my waist and glanced again at the doors, waiting for familiar faces that did not appear. A waiter paused, his smile careful, and began sliding water goblets away from the empty spots, as if erasing witnesses. Somewhere behind me, a woman laughed, the way people laugh when their people show up for them. I pressed my thumbnail into the edge of my napkin until the fabric dented held my posture, and stared down the shine of my fork so I wouldn't cry before my name was called. When the spotlight found me and the room turned, I rose alone. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Small towns, big cities, wherever you call home. And if you've ever had to clap for yourself because no one else showed up, tap the like button and share this with somebody who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed. The next parts of this story are for anyone who's learned the hard way what it means to set a boundary. But to understand why those chairs were empty and how a single night can carry the weight of a childhood, you need to know where all this began. I grew up under a roof where the seasons were kept by a schedule taped to the fridge practice game tournament repeat. Our split level in suburban Chicago had an oak table gouged by homework pencils and an entryway crowded with duffel bags. My father Robert moved with the limp of a man who had once been almost something and never forgot it. His old college jersey hung in the garage like a flag from a lost country. My mother, Diana, was the kind of woman who organized orange slices into tidy rows and built friendships from bleachers. My brother Jason dribbled before he could tie his shoes. I learned to read box scores because numbers were a language the house understood. I tried to translate myself into that language anyway. Soccer in the fall, softball in the spring, basketball in winter, when the gym smelled like rubber and floor wax. I ran the drills, missed the layups, smiled through the huddle, and floated home on the polite applause adults give a child who is trying. In my bedroom, quiet, orderly, I lined up spelling bee ribbons and math medals on a shelf that faced the wall because nobody asked to see them. The living room display case belonged to Jason's trophies, tall and gold and dusted weekly. When I turned 10 and unwrapped the calculator I had begged for, I held it like a jeweled box until I heard my father murmur to my mother in the kitchen, "At least these geek gifts are cheaper than sporting equipment." I pressed the on button under the covers, watched the green numbers glow, and learned that some truths are easier to read in the dark. Years folded, neat, and predictable. 6th grade state math competition, my teacher Mrs. Peterson drove because my parents had Jason's semifinals. She bought me ice cream and told me my mind was a gift, and I stored her words like tucked-away chocolate for later. High school brought Miss Garcia, who had a way of looking straight at you, until the noise fell away. "Have you considered a future in business or economics?" she asked after a brutal midterm, and when I said my parents liked the sound of sports management, she asked what I liked. The question touched bedrock I didn't know was there. She made calls, opened doors, fought for my place at a summer program I couldn't afford, until she made it so I could. That summer at Northwestern, the air smelled like ambition and lake wind, and for the first time, I felt the electricity of being in a room where curiosity wasn't a private habit, but a shared sport. At home, pride traveled in one direction. Even on nights when Jason rode the bench, dinner found a way to circle back to his stats, his coach, his prospects. When I mentioned an internship offer, my father nodded the way you nod at weather. At Thanksgiving, one of his old teammates clapped my shoulder and told my dad, "Looks like she took your competitive drive, just a different court." And my father laughed in that polite, distancing way that says she's more academic. I excused myself to the bathroom. stared at the line of grout between tiles, and gave the mirror a little smile I recognized from every polite picture of a girl standing next to other people's victories. College was a rocket launched from a runway I built plank by plank. I chose Wharton because the letter with the scholarship made even my parents go quiet. I drove there in a used Honda that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and cold coffee. The campus was steel and stone, and a pulse of ideas that didn't apologize for themselves. I called home the first week so full of new names and case studies that the words tripped, and my mother listened, then slid neatly to Jason's preseason 3-point percentage. By sophomore year, I had stopped offering details. My friends celebrated me instead: cheap Italian dinners, mismatched candles, a cake sliced with a dorm knife, and for the first time, the applause I heard was not a private echo. Work found me early because I chased what lit me up. A startup in Philadelphia needed someone who could love a spreadsheet and still talk like a human being, and I said yes. The day my boss Serena told me that some instincts can't be taught. I dialed home to share the sentence and caught my father on his way out the door to Jason's game. "That's nice honey," he said, and I stood in the kitchen at the office phone warm against my cheek, watching steam curl from the coffee machine, and feeling like a person who had knocked and been heard by nobody. New York came next, bright and relentless, the kind of city that lets you reinvent the size of your own voice. Innovative solutions gave me a desk near a window that tasted of the East River when the wind shifted, and a slate of thorny problems everyone else avoided. Victor had an eye for people who run toward the fire. I learned to keep my breathing steady in boardrooms where unreasonable was just another Tuesday. I built a method refined, a model turned a failing account, then 3, then more. And somewhere along the way, the executive team said my name in a room with doors I couldn't open by myself. When Victor called me into his office and slid a packet across the desk, the cover embossed and weighty, I felt the kind of stillness that can hear its own heart. "We're nominating you for the Young Innovator Award," he said, and then, "It's in Chicago. Bring your people." The word people sounded strange, shaped like an invitation. I did what grown daughters do when they still want to be seen. I called my parents. My mother's voice lifted my father's, went warm, and for a few glowing seconds, I let myself imagine what it would be like to look out over a banquet hall and find my family's faces turned toward me, the way I had stood for years, turned toward my brother. I sent them the details, the dates circled in red on our group text, as if calendars could hold intentions in place. 2 days before the ceremony, I was in my hotel room downtown, a high floor with a view of Lake Michigan stretched like hammered metal in the June sun. My gown hung from the closet door, a deeper blue than the sky, a color you choose when you've learned how to carry your own presence. My phone rang. My father's voice had that apologetic weight that announces itself before the words. "America, we have a situation." I sat on the edge of the bed, knees aligned, and listened to the explanation of a recreational league tournament. Jason's team had advanced games scheduled for the same weekend, the whole family already coordinating rides and coolers like it was state finals. "We already committed to your award," I heard my mother say in the background, a small echo of a promise. Then my father cleared his throat. "We think we need to support Jason. These tournaments don't come around often for him anymore. There will be other awards for you. You're always achieving things." It wasn't anger that rose so much as a familiar stillness, the kind that deposits a stone in the chest and leaves you to carry it. I said the reasonable things reasonable daughters say. I said this was important. I said I had told them months ago. I said, please, though I don't remember deciding to. The call ended with logistics and good intentions. I slid the phone onto the nightstand beside the complimentary notepad with the hotel's name in gold ink, and the room seemed suddenly overfurnished with lamps, with air, with a silence so thick it pressed. Award nights have a choreography. People arrive in clusters, checking cuffs and lipstick, practicing names they'll say at microphones. They place purses like anchors and touch the shoulders of those who belong to them. I walked in alone, nodded at acquaintances, found my table with the neat type of my name and 5 others. The florist had chosen white roses and eucalyptus, a centerpiece that smelled clean and faintly medicinal. I was not surprised anymore. I was something hollower and harder to name. The waiter asked if we were waiting for the rest of my party, and I smiled the way you smile when you need to survive the next 2 hours with your dignity intact. When he quietly lifted the extra settings and drifted away, I thought of all the times I had watched my mother wrap forks in napkins for Jason's team banquets, the efficient grace of her hands, the way she could create welcome out of thin air. This was the opposite of that. They called my category late enough that the night had warmed and loosened. The MC praised innovation like it was a civic duty, and a spotlight slid forward like a hand. When my name rose through the speakers, there was a collective turn of heads, as if the room were a single body reaching to see the person luck and labor had chosen. I stood. My chair scraped softly. I crossed a floor that felt longer than any court in my childhood and climbed the steps without looking left or right. At the microphone, words I had practiced in the hotel bathroom came out clean, even kind. I thanked Victor, my teams, the clients who took risks, the professor who once told me to trust the work. The applause had volume, but no faces in it for me. When I stepped down, the award was a cool weight in my hand, elegant as a piece of winter. I set it at my place, its edges catching the chandelier, and the light made small stars on a table now properly set for one. Back in the room, the city was a moving picture framed by glass. Tail lights stitched red down Lakeshore Drive. The lake lay dark and mild. I placed the award on the desk beside the pen and ink hotel stationery, took a photo with the skyline behind it, and sent the picture to our family thread without caption. A bubble appeared, then a thumbs up from my mother. A moment later, a text from my father. Congratulations, followed by Jason's team lost the first game, won the second, playing for third tomorrow. I stared at the screen until the words blurred and set the phone face down. I ordered room service champagne because celebration should not always require witnesses. The cork popped like a small gunshot in the quiet. The first sip tasted like flattery. The second tasted like nothing. I cut into a slice of chocolate cake so glossy it reflected my fork, and the sweetness turned to grit in my mouth. I washed my face, left my gown draped over the back of the chair, and stood at the window in bare feet, breath fogging the glass. Chicago looked like it always had sturdy and unbothered a skyline I loved, even when it didn't love me back. There are nights that fold a life. Sometimes they do it loudly with shouting and slammed doors. Sometimes they do it softly with a glittering room and the hush of a waiter clearing extra plates. I watched a late train thread the dark toward the suburbs where porch lights would be winking on, where my parents would rinse travel mugs and set out jerseys for the morning. I pressed my palm to the cool window and felt it something shifting slow as a tide. I didn't make a speech to the room or a vow to the sky. I didn't throw the phone or call anyone to catalog the hurt. I stood until the lake exhaled and the air conditioning kicked on and a car horn answered another far below. Then I reached for the desk drawer and pulled out the hotel pen, its brass cool in my fingers. On the card, with the crest embossed at the top, I wrote 3 words that made my hand shake even as my letters stayed steady. The next morning, sunlight pushed through the hotel curtains like it didn't know what had happened the night before. The crystal award sat on the desk, catching that thin gold light, throwing small reflections across the wall. I packed it carefully in its case, folded my gown, and placed both in my suitcase without a sound. There was no anger left, only a kind of hollow quiet that settled deep and refused to move. I checked out before breakfast, carrying the bag myself through the marble lobby. Outside, Chicago was already alive horns, footsteps, lake air heavy with humidity. I walked without direction for a while, letting the noise drown out thought. Every corner of that city carried some memory of my family, Jason's tournaments, my father's laughter, my mother's careful cheering. They were everywhere and nowhere, like ghosts of a story that had never included me. By noon, I found myself at the edge of Lake Michigan, near the same stretch of sand where we used to picnic after Jason's games. Children ran in and out of the water, their laughter rising and falling with the waves. I sat on a weathered bench and watched until my reflection steadied in the blue-gray surface. Somewhere in that reflection, I recognized what I'd always avoided admitting: they hadn't forgotten me. They'd never really seen me to begin with. For the rest of that week, I stayed in Chicago under the pretense of taking personal time. I told my team at the office that I needed to rest after the award ceremony, but rest wasn't what I was doing. I walked through the city every day, following the threads of my own childhood. Past the schoolyard where Miss Garcia once waited after class to ask what I wanted. Past the gym where my father coached Jason's first summer league. Every place carried a version of me that had tried to be enough. When my parents texted, the messages were as gentle and empty as usual. "So proud of you, honey. Send photos when you get a chance." Jason's team did great. They placed fourth. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, not even curiosity about how it had felt to stand alone in that ballroom. It was as if they'd skipped a small family dinner, not the most important night of my life. One afternoon, I stopped by a cafe near the university. It was quiet inside, the kind of place where people wrote or read without hurry. I ordered coffee and opened my laptop, pretending to work, but ended up writing instead a list of memories that had built the person I'd become. The night I cried into my pillow after hearing Geek Gifts. The time I won the regional math championship and no one came. My first phone call home from college cut short by Jason's practice schedule. I wrote them all until the page looked like a ledger of invisible debts. I didn't plan the call that came next. My hands moved before I decided finding my parents' number. When my father's voice answered familiar and distant, I asked to speak with both of them. They put me on speakerphone, the faint echo of the kitchen behind them, ice-clinking dishes being put away, the casual noise of a family at ease. "What happened last weekend," I began, "wasn't just about missing an event. It was the last piece of a pattern that's been my entire life." There was a pause, my mother's voice puzzled. "What pattern, sweetheart? The one where Jason's needs always come first? The one where I'm the understanding one, the independent one, the one who doesn't need you?" My father's tone shifted firm, defensive. "That's not fair, America. We've supported both of you." "Differently," I said. "You can name every score Jason ever made, every tournament he's played. Can you name the last 5 things I've achieved?" Silence filled the line. I could almost hear them searching their memories, trying to patch something together. "It's not about the award," I continued quietly. "It's about feeling valued. It's about someone showing up when it matters." My mother's voice softened. "But you're so capable, honey. You've always been so self-sufficient." I had to be. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "Because I learned early that if I didn't take care of myself, no one else would." My father sighed. "You're being dramatic. Real achievement isn't about trophies. It's about family and loyalty." That sentence broke something small and final inside me. I remembered every time family loyalty meant me waiting alone while they cheered for someone else. "I need some space," I said, my voice steady. "I'm done trying to earn what should have been given freely." My mother's panic came through. "America, what does that mean?" "It means I'm stepping back. I won't be calling or visiting for a while. I need to protect myself." "This is ridiculous," my father muttered, but I'd already decided. "It's not punishment," I said softly. "It's a boundary." When I hung up, I sat very still, listening to the silence fill the room. Then I opened my laptop and began removing them from the small places where they still lived. Email filters, social media settings, shared photo albums. I changed my number. I called the office and asked reception not to forward any personal calls. It felt like erasing my own name from a family portrait line by line. The following days were strangely quiet. No more vibrating phone on the nightstand. No half-hearted texts about Jason's new scores. There were voicemails, at first my mother crying softly, my father alternating between irritation and disbelief. My brother sent a single message that read, "Whatever this is, you're overreacting." I deleted it without reply. At work, I threw myself into projects, the noise of deadlines and conference calls filling every space that used to ache. But silence has a way of finding you again. It crept in at night when the city softened and the apartment lights flickered against the glass. I tried to fill it with work, with exercise, with late dinners and early mornings. But the quiet held its ground. When Thanksgiving came, the city emptied. Colleagues flew home to parents and dinners that waited for them. I stayed behind volunteering at a community meal for people without families nearby. The church basement smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, the tables crowded with laughter and stories. Across from me sat an older woman with silver hair pulled into a braid. She looked at my name tag and smiled. "America," she said. "That's a beautiful name. Your parents must have had big dreams for you." I hesitated. "They did," I said, "just not the same ones I had for myself." She nodded, her eyes warm and knowing. "Then you made your own." Later, washing dishes in the kitchen, I thought about what she'd said. Maybe the dreams we build on our own hurt more, but they last longer. When I got home that night, I lit a candle and opened an old journal I hadn't touched since college. The pages still smelled faintly of ink and summer. I started to write again, not about achievements or goals, but about what it meant to be unseen. For the first time, the words didn't sound like complaint. They sounded like truth. Christmas came, and with it, the first real test of my resolve. My mother emailed photos of the family gathering, Jason holding a trophy, cousins smiling, a tree heavy with ornaments I'd made as a child. My father sent a gift card with a note that said, "Despite everything, you're still our daughter." I stared at it for a long time before donating the amount to a literacy program. Some gestures are too small too late. Spring arrived slowly. The air turned softer, the sidewalks filled with people carrying coffee and hope. I started therapy, something I'd postponed for years. Dr. Winters listened more than she spoke, her office filled with plants and afternoon light. She helped me trace the shape of the things I carried. How every success was a way to fill the silence. How my worth had been measured by what I could prove. What would it feel like, she asked one day, to celebrate yourself simply because you matter, not because you've earned it? I didn't have an answer then. But the question followed me everywhere, in the subway, in late-night emails, in the quiet after a long day. Slowly, my life began to rebuild around a different center. I met people who knew nothing about Jason or my parents, who liked me for how I listened, not what I'd achieved. Victor and his wife invited me to dinners, where the talk was laughter and food, not competition. My college friend Olivia moved to New York, bringing pieces of familiarity that didn't hurt. By summer, my apartment no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt like home. I bought a small ficus for the window, took walks along the river, joined a local hiking group on weekends. Each small choice felt like a stitch closing an old wound. One evening, as the sun went down over the skyline, I realized I hadn't checked my family's social media in months. The impulse had disappeared like a fever breaking. I made tea, sat by the window, and let the quiet fill the room. Not the silence of neglect, but the stillness of peace earned. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of being left out. The next morning, I woke with a thought so clear it startled me. Maybe independence wasn't what I'd built to survive. Maybe it was what I'd needed to begin again. And somewhere inside that quiet realization, something small and steady began to grow, the sense that I could build a life not in reaction to what I'd lost, but in honor of what I finally understood. The first time I walked into Dr. Winter's office, I didn't know what I wanted to fix. I only knew that I was tired of feeling like every success needed to heal something it never could. The room itself was calm, soft lamplight, muted walls, a window half open to the hum of the city. She had a way of listening that left space between words, like silence was part of the treatment. For weeks I talked in circles, about work, about childhood, about the award night I pretended didn't still sting. She didn't interrupt or interpret. She only asked small questions that somehow found their way into the center of everything. What would it feel like to celebrate yourself without proving anything I didn't know then? But I carried that question like a small stone in my pocket, turning it over every time I reached for old patterns. Outside therapy, my life moved forward in quiet ways. I joined a hiking group upstate, people who spoke about weather books and local diners instead of deadlines. The first trail was early spring fog still clinging to the ground. There was a man in a red windbreaker who walked behind me most of the way, humming under his breath. When we stopped to rest, he handed me a granola bar and said his name was Michael. He taught high school history, lived in Queens, and had a calmness I couldn't quite place. It wasn't attraction at first, it was recognition, the feeling of being around someone who didn't need you to perform. Back in the city, my apartment had begun to feel different. Fewer late nights, fewer empty takeout boxes, fewer distractions to fill the air. I started reading again, novels, not case studies. On weekends, I wandered through flea markets, drawn to old photographs and hand-painted mugs. I even picked up my camera, something I hadn't touched since college. There was something freeing about capturing moments without attaching them to achievement. At work, momentum came naturally. The clients I'd built trust with brought new opportunities. Victor encouraged me to lead projects others avoided. I noticed that when I stopped chasing validation, people started noticing results. My calm became its own kind of power. One afternoon, Victor stopped by my office with a stack of quarterly reports. "You know, Taylor," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "most people hit this stride after 15 years. You've done it in 6. He smiled in that rare, genuine way. "Keep going exactly as you are." I thanked him, but the praise felt different now, less like oxygen, more like confirmation that I could finally breathe on my own. Dr. Winters called it a shift from proving to being. "It's subtle," she said, "but it changes everything." She was right. I noticed it in small choices, the way I handled criticism, the way I let quiet moments stay quiet. Even the city sounded different, less like a competition, and more like background music. By summer, I'd stopped checking my family's pages or wondering if they thought of me. The ache that used to sit under every joy had softened into something quieter, almost tender. I still thought of my mother sometimes, folding laundry and cheering from bleachers of my father's measured voice on the phone. But the memories no longer dictated how I moved through the day. When the invitation came to speak at a sustainability conference in Boston, I almost turned it down. Public speaking had never been my goal, but Victor insisted it was time. I spent nights preparing slides, wanting them to feel like conversation, not performance. The conference hall was packed the morning of my session. My hands trembled before I walked onto the stage, but once I started talking, everything settled. I spoke about resilience, how systems and people alike need space to adapt. The applause at the end was warm, but not overwhelming. I walked off the stage feeling balanced, like I'd given something honest, not chased applause. A few weeks later, an editor from a business journal called. They wanted to feature my work on sustainable analytics in an upcoming issue. The interview felt casual, more like storytelling than reporting. When the article came out, I read it once and then folded it away. The pride I felt was quiet, personal. It wasn't proof for anyone else. It was proof that I was finally doing the work for the right reasons. Around that time, I saw Michael again at another hike, this one along the Hudson. The air smelled of rain and pine, and he carried a thermos of coffee he kept offering to share. We talked easily, like people who'd met before in another life. Later, when we got caught in a light drizzle, he shrugged off his jacket and held it over both our heads until we reached shelter. It wasn't a grand gesture, just simple kindness. I hadn't realized how rare that had become in my world. We started meeting for walks, then dinners, then long talks that stretched past midnight. I told him about my work, about the city, even about my family, though I left some parts vague at first. He listened, never trying to fix or analyze. One evening, when I started to drift into self-deprecating humor, he stopped me gently. "You don't have to downplay what you've built," he said. "It's not bragging to own your story." His words stayed with me. In therapy, I told Dr. Winters about him. She smiled. "It sounds like he sees you as a whole person, not a project." I nodded, unsure how to explain the relief of that. Fall arrived with sharp air and yellow leaves along the sidewalks. Work grew busier, but it felt manageable. I hired my first assistant, a bright young analyst named Claire, eager and intuitive. She reminded me of myself at 22, eyes full of determination, unaware of how heavy that could become. I tried to lead differently than I'd been led, clear expectations, genuine praise, room to breathe. Then one afternoon, Victor walked into my office holding a printed email. "Forbes is doing their annual list again," he said, setting it on my desk. "They're asking for nominations. I already sent your name." I laughed, caught off guard. "Victor, that's appropriate," he interrupted. "You've earned it. They're looking for innovators redefining industries. That's exactly what you're doing." The process was long interviews, background checks, client verifications. I didn't tell many people. Something about it felt fragile, like touching an old scar. When the reporter finally called for the main interview, her tone was warm, conversational. She asked about the journey, the obstacles, the lessons. At one point, she said, "It sounds like much of your success came after you stopped seeking approval." I paused, smiling at how strange it felt to have a stranger understand so clearly. When the photographer arrived for the feature, he asked how I wanted to be seen. I told him authentic. Just me doing the work. He laughed and said that was the first time he'd heard someone decline glamour shots. The photo captured something simple, me, at my desk, sleeves rolled, explaining a diagram to someone off camera. When he showed me the preview, I saw a woman who looked at peace, not striving, not waiting to be chosen. The morning the issue went to print, I walked to the corner newsstand, bought one copy, and took it home. I made coffee, sat by the window, and flipped to the page. There I was, name bold above a short headline, "America Taylor, Building Business with Heart." The article spoke of innovation, sustainability, and quiet leadership. But what struck me most was a single line in the last paragraph. She builds systems that protect people the way she once learned to protect herself. I closed the magazine and just sat there. It felt like the story had been waiting for me to reach this point, to see myself not as someone running from the past, but as someone finally walking toward her own life. That evening, I celebrated not with a party, but with a small dinner at home. Olivia brought flowers, Michael brought a homemade dessert, and a few colleagues came with laughter and stories. We toasted to the work, to friendship, to peace. No one asked about my family, and I didn't offer. Later, after everyone left, I stepped out onto the balcony. The city lights stretched far, steady, and quiet. I thought of the girl who once sat alone at a table meant for 6. I wished I could tell her that one day she'd sit at another table, smaller, warmer, and every chair would be filled by people who chose to be there. The magazine lay open on the counter behind me, pages catching the breeze. Somewhere I knew my family still existed in their familiar world of games and trophies. I didn't hate them for it anymore, but I also didn't need them to see me to know I existed. For the first time, that truth didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom. And as I watched the lights shimmer against the dark water, I sensed something shifting far beyond the city threads, moving quietly, preparing to weave connections I couldn't yet imagine. It was an ordinary afternoon when the past found me again. I was finishing a client call, sunlight spilling through my office window, when my assistant walked in, holding an envelope. "This came in the mail," she said, setting it on my desk. There was no return address, only my name typed neatly across the front. I waited until the room was quiet again before opening it. Inside was a glossy page torn from a magazine, my Forbes feature, and a small note in handwriting I hadn't seen in a year. "Saw this at the dentist's office. I'm proud of you. Jason." For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at the ink the way his letters tilted slightly to the right like they always had. The paper trembled in my hand before I laid it flat on the desk. Outside, the traffic hummed, as if nothing had shifted, but something inside me had. That night, I told Michael about it over dinner. He listened quietly, setting his fork down halfway through the meal. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Part of me wants to leave it alone. Another part keeps wondering why he reached out now." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes people need to see things in print before they really see them at all." I smiled faintly at that. He always needed the scoreboard. A week passed before I replied. I didn't call. I sent an email, short, polite, uncertain. "Thank you. I'm doing well. I hope you are too." I didn't expect an answer, but the next morning, his name appeared in my inbox. I meant what I said. "I'm sorry for how we treated you. I'm starting to understand. If you'd ever want to talk just me, I'd like that." I read it 3 times before closing my laptop. The words didn't undo the past, but they carried something unfamiliar, humility. I brought it to my next session with Dr. Winters. She studied my face before speaking. "What do you feel reading that?" "Cautious," I said. "But also curious." She leaned back, her voice calm. "Boundaries aren't always walls. Sometimes they're gates. The key stays with you." For days, I thought about that. I remembered Jason as a boy, his grin after every win, the way our parents lit up around him. I also remembered the quiet moments between games, him slipping me half of his sandwich, asking me to quiz him on spelling words before a long drive. Maybe both versions were true. By the end of the week, I wrote him again. "I'm open to meeting. Just us. No expectations." We chose a cafe downtown, halfway between my hotel and his office. I arrived early, choosing a corner table with enough distance from the noise. When he walked in, I recognized him instantly, though he'd changed. His hair was shorter, his shoulders broader, his expression quieter. We shook hands like strangers before sitting down. For a while, we talked about neutral things, the weather work, the coffee. Then he took a deep breath and said, "I've practiced what to say 100 times, and it still sounds wrong." "Then don't rehearse," I said softly. "Just say it." "I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for that night. For all of it. For letting them make you small, for not speaking up." The words landed heavy, the kind that come from real reflection. I looked at him and saw the boy I used to share back seats and whisper jokes with, older now, but finally awake to what had been missing between us. "How did you realize it?" I asked. He smiled faintly, looking down at his cup. "After you stopped talking to us, I was angry. Thought you were overreacting. But then I went home one weekend and saw all my trophies lined up on the shelves, every single one. I couldn't find a single photo of you winning anything, not your spelling bee, not your graduation, nothing. It hit me how wrong that was." He paused. "Then I saw the article. Dad read it too. He didn't say much, just that you were always trying to prove something. And I thought maybe she was trying to prove it to us." The honesty in his voice broke something open in me. I hadn't realized how much I'd wanted someone in that family to finally say those words out loud. We talked for 3 hours. About childhood, about how our parents' love had come with conditions neither of us understood until we were grown. He told me he'd spent years chasing the version of success Dad wanted, even after his sports career ended. "I think I envied you," he admitted quietly. "You built something real. I just played out their dream." When we parted, he asked if he could stay in touch. I nodded. "Let's see where it goes," I said. "No pressure." That night, I couldn't sleep. My phone screen glowed in the dark beside the bed. I opened old photos, birthdays, graduations, holidays, and studied the spaces between us. Maybe the distance hadn't only been mine. 2 weeks later, Jason called again. "Mom wants to see you," he said. "No big gathering, just coffee like this." I hesitated before agreeing. We met at the same cafe. When my mother walked in, she looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair was grayer, her posture careful. She smiled through tears. "You look wonderful," she said, touching my sleeve. "So professional, so grown up." "I am grown up," I answered, trying not to sound cold. We sat down, and for a while, she kept her eyes on her hands. "When I saw that magazine," she said finally, "and realized what you'd achieved while we weren't speaking, it made me question everything." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had. She admitted how she'd centered her life around Jason's games, how my independence had been convenient because it demanded nothing of her. "I thought being proud silently was enough," she said, tears catching in her voice. "I never realized silence could feel like neglect." I didn't interrupt. I let her speak until the words began to slow. When she reached across the table, I didn't pull away. Meeting my father came later. We chose a park neutral ground, the same one where he'd once practiced free throws with Jason. He approached with the same stiff gait I remembered trying for normalcy. "You've done well for yourself," he said, gesturing vaguely as if to include the skyline behind me. "Did you think I wouldn't?" I asked gently. He frowned, unsure how to answer. "I didn't understand your world," he said after a long pause. "Basketball made sense, wins and losses. Business felt abstract." "So you dismissed it," I said quietly. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "I did, and I'm sorry. I should have shown up for you. I just didn't know how." It wasn't eloquent, but it was real. I could see the effort it cost him, the way his jaw tightened around the words. For a man who'd built his life on control, that admission was its own kind of surrender. We walked the length of the park path together, talking about nothing in particular. When we reached the benches overlooking the lake, he stopped. "Your mother says you're starting your own firm," he said. "That's impressive." "I did," I said. "It's doing well." He nodded again, quiet. "I should have told you before I'm proud of you." The words were awkward but sincere. and something inside me softened, not with forgiveness, but with understanding. In the months that followed, rebuilding came in small, careful steps. I visited Chicago on my terms, stayed in a hotel, and kept boundaries clear. There were dinners that went well, and others that didn't. When old habits resurfaced, comparisons, backhanded remarks, I learned to leave before resentment settled back in. Jason and I grew close again, not as rivals or reflections, but as adults choosing each other. Sometimes he'd call just to ask about work or share a story about his new coaching job. The conversations were simple, but they carried something solid. The first time my parents visited New York, I took them to my office. My mother brought homemade cookies for my team. My father wore a suit that looked uncomfortable but dignified. He shook Victor's hand and listened as I explained our latest project. When we sat down for dinner afterward, he raised his glass. "To America," he said, voice steady but soft. "Not just smart, but visionary." "We see you now." I didn't cry. I just smiled and let the moment settle. It wasn't a miracle or a movie ending, but it was enough. That night, after they left for their hotel, I walked through my apartment, touching the edges of the life I'd built, the framed photos, the books, the small plant thriving in the window. Everything felt rooted. For years, I'd believed success meant leaving the past behind. But standing there, I realized healing wasn't about erasing what hurt, it was about growing beyond it. The city outside was quiet, washed in the low hum of evening. I turned off the lights, the reflection of the skyline flickering across the glass. Somewhere in that reflection, I caught my own eyes and saw something I hadn't in a long time: peace. Tomorrow would come, with new work, new challenges, maybe new mistakes. But for the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of being unseen. I was living as someone fully seen, even if only by myself. And that was enough to start again. The morning after my parents' visit, the city felt different, gentler somehow, as if the noise had stepped back to let the light through. I brewed coffee and opened the window, letting the cool breeze wander through the room. The hum of the streets below felt steady and distant, the kind of rhythm you can finally live with once your life stops feeling like a competition. The plant in the window, now tall enough to reach the glass, tilted toward the sun. I smiled at how naturally things learn to grow when given space. For weeks after that dinner, my family and I stayed in careful contact. There were no grand reconciliations, no dramatic apologies, just a rhythm that finally respected everyone's boundaries. My father started calling on Sunday afternoons, short conversations about the weather, his garden, or an article he'd read about sustainable farming. It wasn't deep, but it was real. My mother sent small messages, pictures of family recipes she'd rediscovered, questions about my favorite foods, gentle attempts to rebuild connection through simple care. I responded when I felt ready, not out of guilt, but because I wanted to. That difference changed everything. Jason and I talked most often. Sometimes he'd call during his lunch break, his voice echoing through the gym he coached in. The kids remind me of us, he'd laugh. All energy, no patience. Our bond became something new, equal footing instead of competition. The kind of sibling friendship that had always existed under the noise, waiting for peace to let it breathe. At work, my consulting firm was thriving. The small office that once fit a single desk now held a team of 6. We'd grown slowly, carefully, taking on projects that reflected what I believed in rather than what looked impressive on paper. I learned that leadership didn't mean carrying everything, it meant trusting others to help you build it right. Victor visited one afternoon, leaning against the doorway with that familiar knowing smile. "You've built something remarkable," he said. "Not just the business, the way you run it." His words landed softly, a reminder that pride can be quiet and still feel full. Outside of work, Michael and I had found an easy rhythm too. Weekends meant slow mornings, long hikes, and dinners that turned into hours of talking about everything and nothing. He had a way of grounding me without ever dimming me. Some nights when I caught him watching me across the table, I could see in his eyes that he saw all of me, the drive, the calm, the scars. And he loved me, not despite them, but with them. Spring turned to summer again, and the air thickened with warmth and promise. I took my parents' calls more easily now, no longer bracing for disappointment. The conversations grew lighter, and though the past still existed between us, it no longer defined us. Healing. I realized wasn't about forgetting. It was about living in the same world as the hurt and still choosing peace. When my company reached its 2-year anniversary, my team surprised me with a celebration. They decorated the office with photos from our early projects and ordered a cake shaped like our logo. There was laughter music and that rare feeling of belonging I'd spent so long trying to earn from people who couldn't give it. After everyone left, I lingered by the window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered against the evening haze, the same city that had once swallowed me whole and now felt like home. On my desk, a bouquet of wildflowers sat in a clear vase, Michael's gift. Beneath it, a card with his familiar handwriting for the woman who turned survival into vision. I read it twice, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. Survival had once been my instinct. Now it was creation. Later that week, I traveled to Chicago for a speaking engagement. It felt strange walking those streets again, no longer haunted by the echoes of being overlooked. The air smelled like cut grass and rain. My mother insisted on meeting me for lunch, and this time I said yes. She arrived early wearing a blue scarf I remembered from my teenage years. The conversation was easy, grounded in the present. She asked about my latest project, genuinely curious, and listened the way she once listened to my brother talk about basketball plays. When we finished, she placed her hand over mine. "I hope you know how proud we are," she said. "Not just of what you've done, but of who you've become." For the first time, the words didn't make me ache. I believed them. That evening, Jason joined us for dinner at a small restaurant near the lake. My father came quieter than usual, but smiling more easily. We talked about work, about the city, about my mother's new obsession with learning to paint. There were pauses that used to feel awkward, but now they just felt like space. Space where peace could exist. After dinner, we walked along the lakefront. The sky had turned lavender and gold, the water shifting gently against the shore. My father walked beside me for a while before saying, "You know, I used to think winning was about who crossed the finish line first. But watching you, seeing what you've built, I think it's really about who learns how to keep going." I didn't reply, just smiled and let the words hang between us like something fragile and true. When I flew back to New York the next day, I felt lighter, not because everything was perfect, but because I'd finally stopped expecting perfection. Family like life was something you tended, not something you fixed. That night, as I unpacked, I placed a small framed photo on my shelf, the one Jason had given me months ago. We were children on the beach, building sandcastles by the water. For years, I couldn't look at it without feeling what was missing. Now I saw something else, 2 kids who didn't yet know how their story would unfold, but who loved each other in the way only children can, pure and without measure. I turned off the lamp, leaving the soft glow of the city as my only light. Outside, the night was calm, the steady pulse of traffic fading beneath the hum of wind through the trees. I made a cup of tea, opened the balcony door, and stepped out barefoot. The air was cool and sweet with spring rain. Somewhere below, someone was playing a piano, soft, uneven notes carried upward through the night. I leaned against the railing, listening. The melody reminded me of the old church recitals my mother used to take me to when I was little. I hadn't thought about those nights in years, the hush before the music began, the feeling of possibility in the air. It struck me how life always finds ways to circle back, not to repeat, but to reconcile. Behind me, the magazine cover from last year still sat framed on the bookshelf. I looked at it one last time before turning away. The woman in that photo had been strong, ambitious, determined. The woman I was now felt different, calm, whole, no longer chasing proof of her worth. I smiled to myself, whispering words that felt like a prayer. Peace isn't something they give you, it's something you decide to keep. The piano below shifted to a brighter key, and I let the sound fill the air between the buildings. If this story found something familiar in your heart, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe you've had to walk away from something to find your own peace. Share your story below, and if this one spoke to you, stay a while. There are more stories here about quiet strength, second chances, and the courage to begin again. Because sometimes the truest revenge is simply living well and finally living free.